I'm Garth Nix, author of The Old Kingdom or Abhorsen series, the Seventh Tower series and the Keys to the Kingdom series and many other books. So many people sent in questions and thank you so much. I'm really grateful and I'm here to answer as many of them as I can get to. I have tried to write purely realistic fiction, contemporary fiction, and along the way something strange always creeps in, and I can't explain why that is so, but nearly always I get partway through a story and I just suddenly think it would be so much better if they were telepathic, or there was magic involved, or the world isn't quite the same world that we think it is. So I seem to instinctively want to write fantasy. Seventh Tower series is an unusual one because Lucasfilm actually came to Scholastic and said they wanted to have a fantasy book series that they could use to then build upon it to create other media opportunities, to create television or film. And Scholastic came to me and said, do you want to do this fantasy series for Lucasfilm? And you'll get to invent it all. It's the Untitled Lucasfilm Fantasy Series. It can be whatever you want. And I said, no, I'm not interested, because they would completely own it. And we went backwards and forwards for a long time on that. And it did emerge that while they actually didn't have any real ideas, they did have some sort of bullet points for things that they wanted to include. And one of them was Japanese feudal society. And one was a world where it's always night. By this time I'd sort of got a bit interested, and also they kept offering me more money, which has a very powerful effect. So eventually I agreed that I would do it, and I took some of those bullet points and I invented the world and the basic story. And so from their idea of Japanese feudal society, I worked out this hierarchical society based on light, because the world was dark, it was always night. And I had to work out why that was so, and so on. And the business of light and the towers really came from the idea that it was dark. And I thought, well, light would be so important, and the spectrum would be so important. So that's where everything came from there. The sunstones, all of that all came from that one basic bullet point. World is dark. World is always dark.
I see that a studio has recently acquired the rights to the Keys to the Kingdom series. Do they plan on turning this into a television show? Are there any updates that you're willing to share with us about the development of that potentially?
It is in development with Abhorsen Entertainment. The last I heard, they're planning probably 7 streamed movies is the plan. That may be subject to change. And the last thing I heard was that they probably had an actor to play Arthur on board, and they were talking to a couple of different directors, but there's still a long way to go. So who knows? Fingers crossed we'll see something good. When I first began Sabriel, I knew that I wanted an anti-necromancer, someone who made dead things be dead again. And I did look at various beliefs about getting rid of the dead, banishing ghosts, getting rid of evil spirits and so on in different cultures. One of the things, which I guess was fairly obvious I was looking at, was the rite of exorcism by bell, book or candle. And I was looking at that and I was thinking, well, books, I don't want them just to have magic books, spell books where they read spells and get rid of the dead, because that's been done. And candles, well, candles I thought weren't very dramatic, and candles would have logistical problems in terms of trying to light them. And bells seem instinctively magical anyway. I think they are mysterious. And I think that's the first time I became aware that church bells often have names. And the bells in the Nine Tailors have very evocative names. You could say the cultural influence in this case was the tradition of naming bells in Western Christianity. I'm not fussy about how you say my names. However you hear them is actually absolutely fine. That said, I will say them for you now so you can hear how I say them, but it's not necessarily how they should be. So here we go. The 7 bells. Ranna, Mosrael, Kibeth, Dairam, Belgaea, Saraneth, and Astariel.
Now, myself and some of my creative colleagues recently have been thinking about the phrase perfection is the enemy of done. And it's something that bothers me a lot when I'm trying to create in my own art forms is I worry too much about if something I've already created is already good enough, and I'll kind of go back and worry over these things and in the end not end up producing as much as I'm perhaps really capable of. So I wanted to ask, is this something that affects you at all as a factor when you're writing? And do you have any strategies for overcoming it?
Overcoming that desire for perfectionism is actually, one of the ways to do it is just to do more work, is to do new things and to move forward so your mind goes forward and isn't always looking back, isn't always dwelling on how you can make what you've already done better in some way. You need some perfectionism. I mean, you don't need perfectionism, but you do need to strive to make things better, which in the case of writing means returning to the writing and editing it and redoing it, and if things don't work, throwing them out and doing them again. In all of my books, I revise them many, many, many times. And in fact, the way that I work normally means that I write chapter 1, and then when I've done chapter 1, I'll revise it, and then I'll start writing chapter 2. However, when I go back again, I'll revise chapter 1 and 2, and then I'll start chapter 3, and when I finish chapter 3, I'll revise chapter 1, 2, 3, and then write chapter 4. So that's a technique for continuing to polish your work, but also continue forward, because you do have to keep pushing forward. As the old saying goes, the difference between an amateur writer and a professional one is that professionals finish things. Half a novel can't be published. Half a short story won't appear anywhere. Half a poem. So you do need to finish things, and sometimes overcoming that desire to make what you've already done perfect has to be overcome. And the other thing I think is also good is when things are published and they are out there and they are in the world, is don't worry about them. Again, focus on the new work and what you can do with the stories you want to tell now, the things you want to create now, and not worry about what's happening with the old things. I think that's much healthier in the long run, and also leads to just doing more work. So good luck with all your creative work. We're acquaintances, I guess you'd say. I would love to be a friend of Philip Pullman, but I've only actually met him in person once, though we've corresponded a little bit. And actually, he was also very kind recently, year before last, when I was in Oxford, very, very briefly, for about 6 hours, and I had to do an event at a bookshop at lunchtime, and the Tolkien exhibition was on, but it was in its last few days, and it was completely sold out. And I'd hoped that I'll be able to nip in there before the event. And so I went on Twitter and I plaintively said, I'm very sad I won't be able to go to the Tolkien exhibition because I'm not in Oxford long enough and it's sold out. And I must admit, I did have a slightly ulterior motive that I was hoping someone on Twitter might see it and help me out. And Philip Pullman did. All of a sudden, we got to visit the Tolkien exhibition. I was very grateful for that. So thank you again, Philip Pullman. Feeling the pressure. There is no planned sequel to Angel Mage, but I may return to it. My next book, which comes out in September, is The Left-Handed Booksellers of London. Next year, the book following will be a new Old Kingdom book called Terciel and Eleanor. I'm not quite sure what it will be after that. I have a number of different things that I'm weighing up what to do. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, it's in some of my past work as well, though not so much in the novels. And it's certainly something that I want to work on and do more of. Representation for everyone, really. And I guess it took me quite a long time to realise, as with other authors, that it's not enough to presume that you know that a character in your book is LGBT or has a different background or is from a very different background or any of the things that make them different. You have to actually definitively say so in the work, not separately. So that is certainly something that I'm hoping to do more of and be more thoughtful about.
Out of all the books you've published so far, which one has been your favorite and why?
I've got a slightly cheeky answer to that, because my favourite book is always not one that I've published. It's always one that's coming up. It's always one that I'm writing or I'm planning to write. Because when I imagine the books, they're always really, really amazing in my head. The story is always really, really, really incredible, and I'm desperate to write it, and I want to get it out there. But when I've written it, even though I get close to what I've imagined, and I'm always very proud of those books, all of my books, they're never quite exactly what I wanted them to be. I can never get absolutely what I want to get down on the page. And I always fondly imagine that next time I will be able to write the perfect book. Next time I will be able to put what's in my head on the page. But of course, the danger is that if I do ever write that perfect book, maybe I'll just sort of like drop dead on a spot, because I'll have written the perfect book. What do you do after that? So always the next one. Hello, Maria in Scotland, 27. Yes, I would. It would need to be the right developer with the right kind of backing and expertise. I love video games. I've been a gamer my entire life, basically, both tabletop games and video games. And so I have very strong opinions about what works in games and what doesn't. Like almost everything else to do with my work, I think it's just a question of the right people coming along at the right time, and so I can team up with them. I had a very early start playing the very first Dungeons and Dragons from when I was 12, I think, the original white box and the 3 little booklets, and have played off and on ever since, different RPGs. So I would love to see one. I personally don't have time to do it. Writing new stories and everything else pretty much occupies all my time, and then more, which I don't even have. I'd like to see someone do it. A lot of people have done work on it for D&D in particular. They've created Abhorsen classes and so on, and have run campaigns using the setting of the books for their own purposes. Some of that you can find online. No one has done an authorised campaign setting or specific authorised rules as such. But again, if I could find the right people to work with, that's something that might happen in the future. There were so many books that affected me so strongly. I mean, there's too many to list. But some of the real standouts include almost everything by Diana Wynne Jones, by Joan Aiken, particularly her sort of alternate England stories that begin with The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, but also I love her short stories, almost everything that she does. The Lord of the Rings had a huge impact on me, Tolkien and The Hobbit. Lloyd Alexander, his Chronicles of Prydain, Alan Garner and his books, particularly The Weirdstone of Brisingamen and The Moon of Gomreth, but also later some of the books I didn't really understand as a teen, but I've constantly reread, like The Owl Service and Red Shift. There's so many. Ursula Le Guin, I'm a massive fan of both her science fiction and her fantasy. Away from fantasy and science fiction, also I love writers of historical fiction. Big fan of Georgette Heyer and her Regency romances. Not a detective fiction so much, interestingly. But speaking of detective fiction, also in my teens I first was introduced to Dorothy Sayers and and her books, which I love, and there's a huge number of authors who had an enormous impact on me. There is a list of some of them on oldkingdom.com.au. There's an article that I wrote for Library Magazine in the United States, which is an A to Z of some of my favourite childhood authors. So you can take a look at that as well as the ones that I've mentioned here. I love growing up in Canberra. I'm very fond of Canberra, even though I've not lived there for 30 years. And my favourite place is one that's not there anymore as such, because it was the children's library at the O'Connor shops. There was a dedicated children's library, that small kind of little shed thing that is opposite the shops in the park. And it was such a treasure trove of books for me. I went to Turner Primary and I used to walk to school and walk home from school. And walking home, I'd stop at the library and I would hand in my books from the day before and I would get new books. And so many of the books that were really, really important in my education as a writer and as a reader came from that little children's library. So that's probably one of my favourite places in Canberra, and a really important memory as well, which went on for many years, and really it laid the foundation probably for everything that I've done ever since as a writer, came from that, and from the school libraries as well.
So I've been a fan of the Sabriel trilogy since forever, and I'm absolutely ecstatic at the chance to ask Garth Nix this question. As a creative, what do you feel the biggest missed opportunities in your own work have been? So whether that's moments that you never really got to put to paper or never really manifested as you'd have wished them to, or things that over time you feel maybe have aged poorly or that you would do differently if you could do it again. I imagine there are a whole bunch, just as any creative type is likely to have. So whichever you find the most pertinent, the ones that stick out the most to you.
Hey Jordan, thank you for your very thoughtful question about missed opportunities or regrets. And so it's a question that really has to make me think, because I don't really have any, which it does make me think about myself. I'm not quite sure what it says. Particularly with my work, I don't really look backwards. I'm always looking forward. I'm always wanting to do the next thing. And to me, they feel separate things. They're separate to me. They're like grown-up children. I mean, I made them, but then they went out in the world and they are what they are. And I don't want to go back and change them. Interestingly, they're just being reissued in the United Kingdom. We've moved them to Bonnier Hotkey Publishing, and I've just this last week I had to read the page proofs of their edition of Sabriel, and I'd not really read it carefully for a long time. And the proofreader suggested a couple of changes where, admittedly, the language was not ideal. There was a few places where it was just a little bit clunky, or it could be misconstrued. And I sat and thought about it for some time, thinking, well, yes, I could fix this up, and it is only one word. It's just changing one word here and there. And ultimately, I decided to leave it alone. I decided to leave the book exactly as it has been through many, many editions in different places. So the new British one will be the same as all the others. And in a way, it felt like this thing is so separate from me. Even though I wrote it, it's not up to me to change it. Some fantasy authors do work out all the details of the world, and they develop the magic and so on before they work out the story, before they work out the story they're going to tell in the world that they've created. But I don't do that. I work it all out as I go along. The story has to feel like it's the tip of the iceberg. What you're reading is the visible part, but you feel the depth of all that myth and legend and lore lurking beneath the surface of the story. Some writers work all of that out. Very famously, Tolkien. He actually worked out all of that iceberg under the surface. Whereas I tend to just work out what I need, and I hint at the other stuff that's there, And then the hint is also for myself, for later stories where I'll need to connect it up and bring it up to the surface to roll that iceberg a little bit. But I don't work it out beforehand, I work it out as I'm going along. Some of the tried and true methods for an author to begin to be published is to start with writing short fiction first, because obviously you can write short fiction faster usually, and there are actually many avenues for it to be published, even more so these days because of the many online magazines and so on, as well as the actual print magazines. A lot of it is just about not giving up. It's about writing a book and trying to get it out there. And I would try agents first. I would do your research. And again, there's lots of online resources for this. Look at the agents who are thanked in the acknowledgements of your favourite authors, and they'll always thank their agent. You can make a short list from that. One of the important things, of course, is to read, which is great because it's fun and interesting, and you don't have to even work harder. You instinctively absorb storytelling techniques and even grammar from reading widely. In fact, I learned to use semicolons from reading The Lord of the Rings when I was 10. I had no idea what they were for until I saw them in Lord of the Rings. And keep doing that, and keep writing new things, and continuing on, because every new work, whether it's a story or a script or a book or whatever, is a new chance. As I said, there's a lot of luck involved, so every new chance you get is another spin of the wheel. My next book is The Left-Handed Booksellers of London, which comes out in September, from Allen and Unwin in Australia. It's a fantasy thriller. It's set in London in 1983. I'm also, at the moment, I'm writing a new Old Kingdom book, which is called Tercial and Eleanor, which is about Sabriel's parents. All being well, that should come out in roughly September 2021.
My name is Jacob. I have a question to ask you. FYI, for your information, I know Bendy. The question I was going to ask is, where did you get the name Arthur Penhaligon from?
Hi Jacob, thanks for your question. And you know my sister-in-law Bindi. That's good to know. So Arthur Penhaligon, I was kind of trying to be a bit too tricky there, because I wanted to have a name that suggested a famous name like Arthur Pendragon, who is obviously King Arthur, but he's actually not the kind of chosen one like Arthur Pendragon is. So I was trying to suggest that, but also not be him, which is possibly too tricky for words. Penhaligon actually is an old Cornish name, and I just like the sound of it. And I think it wasn't until afterwards that I realised there is actually a company called Penhaligons, or Penhaligon in the United Kingdom, that I think makes shampoo and aftershave and things like that, which isn't quite what I was looking for. In some ways, it's the kind of question I often wouldn't answer, because I'd say it's the kind of thing I would only answer actually in a story. I think a lot of things are best not directly answered when they relate to the sort of myth or lore that underpins the story. So often I kind of save those and I want to put them in stories myself, as opposed to just directly telling you the answer. But actually, in this case, I will tell you the answer, because I think that Mogget would actually look the same to both of them. He can only take one form at a time, but it is a very interesting question. So thank you for that. The Clayr would only give birth to a male child if they chose to do so. Charter Magic would give them, not only allows contraception, there are charter mark spells for contraception, there'd also be charter marks you could use to determine the gender of your child, and thus all kinds of ramifications from that. So they could choose to have male children, Whether they do and what happens to them is something that I think I'll keep for a story. Interesting questions. I have no immediate plans. My next Old Kingdom book is a prequel to Sabriel. See, I said Sabriel there. Sometimes Sabriel, sometimes Sabriel. So Terciel and Eleanor is about Sabriel's parents. That's the next book. But it's not impossible that I'll come back after Golden Hand and come back to the Old Kingdom again. I spend a lot of time on names. I try different combinations of word fragments and words and prefixes and suffixes and so on to get the kind of name that I want that has the right resonance. In the case of Sabriel, for example, when I was trying to find a name for her, and I knew that she was this kind of anti-necromancer who laid the dead to rest, and I was thinking, well, I want a name that suggests power but also darkness. And so I was looking at words that literally meant darkness and night and dark and so on. And I got really quite off the track and I started playing around with the heraldic term sable, which means black in heraldic language. So I was playing with sable and I was starting to look at the IEL endings that you find in angels' names. Because they suggest power, they're resonant of power. And so Sabriel came about from me doing endless combinations of sable and the IEL and AEL endings that you find in angels' names before I eventually arrived at Sabriel. Thank you so much for all your very thoughtful questions. Thank you also to The Guardian for arranging the questions to be asked and for me to answer them. It's made me think about a whole bunch of stuff. So thank you very much. Keep reading and stay safe.